So welcome back to the night hacking at Swamp Up. My name is Yolande Poirier from Oracle Technology Network, and I have with me Jennelle and Jessica. I was confused about with the J's.
Yeah, there's so many J's. Yeah, lots of J's.
So,
Frog.
yes, Java, you know. Yeah.
Exactly.
So you two are actually involved with DevOps, and so what kind of trend do you see in DevOps?
So we're really kind of seeing the shift in the industry between developers and operations, and you want. Oh, thank you very much. So you want. Now we can talk.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's kind of where both operations and developers both kind of have to start speaking the same language, and they have to be able to communicate with each other, so they both have to understand both sides. We're starting to see this kind of culture shift and practices that are starting to be put in place that IT never really had to worry about before, such as source control and CI/CD and all these acronyms. There's always so many acronyms, but infrastructure as code, all these things that operations didn't necessarily have to do, but developers have kind of kept as a standard, and then vice versa as well. Is now developers are now starting to have to worry about things that operations did, as far as infrastructure and backend and security. Jennelle, if you want to tie in.
Yeah, it's really interesting coming from the operations space, because if you've been doing operations for the last 2 decades, you have been doing things a certain way, and you want to bring that together and start utilizing the tools that developers are using, and then also being able to impart some of that knowledge on developers, because in most cases you're working for the same company, you have the same goals. It's like, how do operations folks start looking at kind of the new way of doing things faster, being able to repeat things easier, and how does that help them from an operations standpoint? How do you improve release cycles? How do you improve what your customer gets? How do you improve things like disaster recovery and things like that, those core operations components, using some of the tools that your developers might already be using, and how can you find new tools to work with together?
So since you're coming from the system administration point of view, so what would you say to somebody who is new, who needs to make the shift? What would you tell them about, about like the lack of changes, or how would you sell the DevOps idea to somebody on the system administrator side?
So I would really say DevOps itself, like one of the questions I hear, especially when DevOps is still a new concept, and in a lot of ways it's a new word that we're really hearing in our industry. It's not a tool that you really go out and buy, it's a practice that you start to adopt. So one thing that really helped me personally, and I know it's so cliche to say, but to read the Phoenix Project, I mean that's a really great book about DevOps and kind of explains the value behind it. But then to start really kind of understanding the purposes for it, and it's kind of a 4-part purpose where you have your planning, you have to start the conversation with people, but then you get to where you start off with a plan, then you go through your develop and test, then you get to release, and you get to monitor and learn. So now you start to have this almost circle or this wheel of, I know now these different steps. So from the operations side, I can take my code or my infrastructure, where previously I might have to stand up a physical server or a virtual machine. Now I can take that and put that into code and put that more in my develop and test. Even though as an operations person or IT, I wouldn't have called myself a developer, I'm really developing infrastructure. That's what I have been doing. I just didn't know that's what I was doing. So, I mean, I think the biggest thing that I would recommend is be open to change, even though that's a little scary, and then to kind of figure out how you can take the things that you're already doing you might not be aware of and put those in those 4 buckets.
It's definitely about not being afraid of this new way of doing things. A lot of times it's like, well, if I don't do it this way, I'm going to lose my job. And it's not about that. It's improving your job. It's really looking at processes and figuring out how you can improve them and document them first, and then use that documentation to build automation. So now you're not spending time spinning your wheels, doing processes over and over again that take a long period of time. You can now shift to doing things that are more critical for your organization. Things like more business process, more business management, learning to make decisions that really affect the outcome of what the goal is in your industry, whatever you're doing, and not so much spending a lot of time in the server room monkeying with servers, or dealing with things that you did potentially repeat a lot for the sake of that was just the way things were always done. How do you start building processes that you can iterate quickly in a time of need?
One thing I would add to that is she mentioned like documenting and I mean, how can you kind of move on from that? I was telling her actually before this that I remember at previous jobs I would spend so much time writing documentation on how I created this VM or how I installed this application and how I essentially did all of these steps. Why not just put that in code and then the documentation is call this script. Here's everything else where I can go back and look at which version of Java I installed on this machine and which operating system it was running and which version of which operating system, and everything's already documented in detail so that when I need to quickly stand up that infrastructure again, I know my documentation says just call this.
The code becomes the documentation. Exactly. And if you're using source control tools, which isn't a traditional operations tool, but taking advantage of tools that developers are already using, now you also have that documentation history, which meets, compliance needs and audit needs and all of these other things that kind of came to ops as these dreaded sort of tasks are starting to easier to meet those requirements.
And they're almost like welcome requirements now, because now as IT, if I have to go back and see what did I do 3 months ago from this deployment, I can go back to my commit history and see old code, and then if I know that something's broken, what's changed? I now don't have to second guess or pray that I can look through my history. Now there's actual written history, so it is something that's welcome, and now from the operations, whereas before I was dreading this, now I'm welcoming it.
So you also have to work differently with developers. So any insight that you had or tips or?
It's all about process. It really is looking at what the end goal is. What is this end product that we're trying to do, and working backwards from those things and being like, what do we do? Who does what? Who touches these things? Whose time could be better spent? I don't want to say anybody's time is wasted, but who can have a better way of spending their time? How can we, simplify this for this person? How can we solve problems where only this person can do this particular task? How do we eliminate those sources of potential failure and really, spend a lot of time looking at that? Because as operations, we can bring a lot of insight to a process or parts of the process that are a little cloudy potentially for a developer, and a developer can bring insight to the parts that are a little cloudy for ops.
I would completely agree with that. I mean, there's a concept, I guess, that kind of goes along with DevOps called value stream mapping, and you actually start with drawing out on, go back to like pen and paper days and not use any kind of technology, and you start off with the end product, and then you draw essentially this map all the way backwards to the planning stage, and it allows both developers and operations to see things from the other person's perspective, and you're able to see where both a developer or an IT pro or systems administrator is maybe having to do above average efforts or heroic efforts or manual efforts just for this simple task, and the developer looks at it and says, oh, well, I can easily take care of that. And then the operations person looks at what the developer's doing and says, oh, well, I can help you with this. You need a developer environment, so now I can give you microservices or containers, something to help ease your job, and then you can help me ease mine when it comes to pushing that maybe to QA and staging, and you eliminate those problems or those potential failures. So you're able to now deploy your code because you're working together and speaking the same language. You're able to now deploy code faster and have those fewer failures because everyone's able to see the big picture from the other person's perspective.
So it's a lot more collaborative and not like so antagonistic and saying, well, this is your fault. No, yeah.
There's no more blame, really. Like once you, it is a process and it does take some getting used to, but there's no more blame of, I remember being the systems administrator where web developers would give me their applications and I'd push that, and then I pushed it and it didn't work, and so now it's my fault because I deployed their code. And
the only thing you have left is reboot the server. You have no tools because your developer didn't understand that maybe you needed, some sort of, ability to reset or ability to restart a certain service, or kind of control or some monitoring or some alerting or some sort of metric so that you could use to predict a failure. All of those things, are often not built in as a function, and so providing that operations perspective allows everything to sort of move forward in a better fashion.
Well, and then once you are not having those conversations of blame, you're able to have conversations where you are collaborating and you are moving forward, looking at the end goal, because at the end of the day, both a developer and an operations has the end goal of going home and not getting a phone call at 2 a.m. because the website is down. So why not work together on that rather than spend 20 minutes arguing about why it doesn't work? Now we can work together to not only make it work, but then be proactive in that to ensure that it continues working and you don't run into those reactive scenarios in the future.
So, if you had to give tips for people who are looking to move into the DevOps processes, I mean, what kind of tips, or how would you say like it changes the cultural? A lot of people point to like a cultural change, right, as the main thing that needs to be changed. Is that really the case, or is it part of the process? How do you see that?
I mean, I think that is a really key aspect, is the culture overall is what does need to change. It starts with people before you go on to anything else, because the key part in either developer or operations is you have those people that you have to at least ensure that they're open. So I would think the biggest thing is for somebody who's interested, like, be open to change and having that conversation and working with somebody from a background that you might not previously speak their language. I mean, IT and developers typically and historically have not spoken the same language or have understood the same pain points. So once you're open to, you might not understand, but that's okay, that's part of the process, you'll be able to move that much faster.
Yeah, and you do have to start looking at new tools and realizing that, maybe if you haven't done a lot of scripting or you haven't done a lot of stuff via code, start learning a little bit more about those tools, start learning how to use them so that you can sit down with developers and honestly look at a process. I think the easiest way to start that conversation, it's easy to say, oh, it's a culture shift. Well, how do you encourage that culture shift? And sometimes looking at a process and having an honest conversation about how we get from point A to point B, where can you start seeing where those breakdowns happen between developers and operations and figure out how you can start fixing those. And then the culture change sort of comes out of that. Sometimes you just need to have a starting point and it's just a conversation about, something that failed last. How do we look at that without blame? Because the reality is just because Bob or Sally was the last person to press the button that, made that thing implode, a series of unfortunate things, set that up. And how do you find the series of unfortunate events and start correcting them?
I would completely agree. And the key word that she said in there is having that honest conversation. And what you have to realize is when you're having a conversation and there's blame back and forth and arguing, that's an emotional conversation. That's not an honest conversation. So you take that out of it. No one's at fault. We know that problem exists. Now let's move on from it and then have that conversation of how you can adopt those new tools or those new practices to both make everyone's lives easier in the future.
Excellent. Any other tips or any other things maybe from your presentation as well that you would like to share with our audience?
One thing that I would say from IT is don't be scared of code. I think that's the biggest thing. Because people in IT, we tend to not, we see code and we think, oh God, what is this? But don't be scared of code. My eyes.
It burns, yeah.
Don't be scared of code. The more you start to look at things from a developer perspective and then tie that into your own code and infrastructure as code or IAC, you'll start to see on how functions and objects actually, even though those words might be scary, I promise you it's okay, those things start to actually really play an important role in your infrastructure and how you stand that up. So like she said, like adopting new tools, but adopting also new terminology and overcoming those fears.
Yeah, it's really about it's totally about being open-minded and about stretching. Like if you don't know where to begin, maybe talk to a developer and be like, what are you trying to do? What challenges are you having? Can I fix that with building infrastructure a different way? And sort of challenge yourself. Sometimes it's about going with what you know. If you work on if all you do is build web servers, how can you build a web server without only using code or only from the command line or doing it just a way that's a little harder than what you're used to? You know what the end result's going to be, so you know what success looks like, because one of the hardest things is learning something new and not even knowing what success looks like. So you can just be like, hey, I know what a web server looks like at the end. How can I do that using more code, using more, command line, and learn from that, and just kind of pick something that you do know that's, potentially small and easy and might be sort of stupid, but how do you recreate that in a different environment, a different way?
Cool. Well, thank you so much for all your explanation. I think this is a lot of insights actually from first hand. So awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.